On a bitter Christmas morning in the 18th century, a powerful baron made a purchase he believed was ordinary, even generous by the cruel standards of his time. Twin slave girls bought like objects, wrapped as gifts for his sons, were meant to be symbols of wealth and obedience. Lives reduced to property before they had ever been allowed to choose who they were. But history has a way of breaking the expectations of those who think power is permanent. What no one inside that grand estate could foresee was that these two girls would refuse to disappear quietly into bondage. Through courage, intelligence, and a bond stronger than iron chains, their actions would ignite consequences far beyond the manor walls, challenging authority, exposing hidden truths, and altering the fate of everyone involved. This is the story of a single Christmas gift that shattered an entire system. The baron's Christmas tradition was spoken of in hushed admiration among the local elite, praised as evidence of his refinement, generosity, and unwavering authority. Each winter, as the estate prepared for the holy season, wagons arrived heavy with silk, silver, and rare foods from distant ports. Fires were kept burning day and night, halls decorated with pine and candles, and choirs rehearsed hymns meant to echo purity and goodwill. To outsiders it appeared as a celebration of faith and prosperity, a reminder that God had favored this house above others. Yet beneath the polished floors and glowing candlelight, the tradition concealed something far darker, something that had little to do with joy and everything to do with power. Christmas in the baron's world was not only a time of giving but a time of possession, a moment when he reaffirmed his dominance by choosing what could be owned, displayed, and consumed. For the baron, gifts were never simply gifts. They were statements. Each one carried a message about hierarchy, obedience, and entitlement. Horses symbolized control over land, jeweled watches symbolized control over time, and human beings symbolized control over life itself. In his mind, the act of buying enslaved people was no different from purchasing furniture or livestock. He spoke of them in numbers, not names, and justified their suffering through inherited beliefs passed down through generations of men like him. Christmas only amplified this mindset. While sermons spoke of humility and compassion, he interpreted the season as proof that his wealth and authority were ordained, that his ability to give meant he had the right to take. The tradition had begun years earlier, long before the twins were even born. At first it was subtle. An enslaved boy presented to a son who had come of age, a young girl gifted to a daughter-in-law to serve as a personal attendant. These offerings were framed as practical solutions, rewards for loyalty, or lessons in responsibility. The baron believed that by giving his children human property, he was teaching them how the world truly worked. He wanted them to understand dominance early, to feel comfortable issuing orders, to grow accustomed to seeing fear and submission as natural responses. Over time, the gifts became more extravagant, more calculated, and more cruel, reflecting both the baron's growing wealth and his deepening detachment from humanity. By the time that particular Christmas arrived, the tradition had evolved into a spectacle. Traders were summoned months in advance, instructed to find something rare, something that would impress. When the baron heard of twin slave girls, young, identical, and unseparated, his interest sharpened. Twins were unusual, valuable, and symbolically powerful. To him they represented symmetry, novelty, and the ultimate proof that even the most intimate human bond could be bought and transferred. He did not ask about their parents, their language, or the circumstances of their capture. Those details were irrelevant. What mattered was the impact the gift would have on his sons and on anyone who witnessed the exchange. The cruelty of the act was disguised beneath layers of ritual and respectability. Contracts were signed with clean hands, payments made in gold, and the transaction recorded as a lawful exchange. The girls were bathed, dressed, and instructed to stand quietly, their fear masked by forced stillness. Servants were warned to speak softly, to avoid any disturbance that might disrupt the holiday mood. Even the church bells ringing in the distance seemed to participate in the deception, their sound merging with the illusion that this was a righteous household, celebrating a sacred day. No one openly questioned the contradiction between the message of Christmas and the reality unfolding within the estate walls. The baron himself felt no conflict. He saw his actions as both generous and efficient. By gifting the twins, he believed he was providing his sons with servants for life, ensuring loyalty rooted in fear and dependence. He imagined the girls growing older under his roof, their identities erased, their labor absorbed into the daily functioning of the estate. In his calculations, their existence would benefit everyone who mattered. The sons would learn authority, the household would gain workers, and the baron would reinforce his reputation as a man who spared no expense for his family. The suffering of the girls was invisible to him, filtered out by privilege and reinforced by a system designed to excuse it. What made the tradition especially insidious was how normalized it had become. Guests who attended the Christmas gathering spoke of the baron's generosity, not his brutality. Other landowners took notes, some with admiration, others with envy. Children laughed, wine flowed, and music filled the halls while two lives were silently redefined as possession. The estate itself seemed complicit, its towering walls and locked gates serving as physical reminders that this world operated by different rules. Inside, morality bent to convenience, and cruelty wore the costume of celebration. Yet even within this carefully maintained illusion, there were cracks. Servants exchanged glances, older than fear, heavier than obedience. Some remembered other Christmases, other gifts, other lives absorbed and erased. They knew that something about this tradition carried consequences, even if those consequences had not yet surfaced. The Baron ignored these undercurrents, convinced that power once established remained unchallenged. He could not imagine that a tradition built on domination might one day turn against him, that an act meant to display control could instead expose its fragility. The purchase of the twin girls was the culmination of years of unchecked authority, a moment when cruelty reached its most polished form, wrapped in ritual, justified by law, and celebrated as generosity. The act revealed how deeply the Baron's world had inverted morality. Christmas season meant to honor birth, hope and redemption, became the stage for one of his most dehumanizing decisions, a decision made without hesitation, without doubt, and without the faintest awareness of how close he was to losing the very control he believed he was displaying. They were brought onto the estate without announcement, without ceremony, as though their arrival were an afterthought rather than the center of the Baron's plan. The wagon stopped at the side gate instead of the main entrance, its wooden sides stained from long travel and its wheels caked with frozen mud. When the door opened, the cold rushed in, sharp enough to steal breath, and with it came the first glimpse of the twins. They were small for their age, wrapped in thin cloaks that did little to protect them from the winter air. Their hands were bound loosely, not because they were resisting, but because binding had become habit, a reflex of ownership even before ownership was formally declared. No one asked their names. The trader had heard them once, spoken softly in a language unfamiliar to him, but he had not bothered to remember. Names complicated things. Names suggested history, family, origin. In this world, those details were considered unnecessary. When the Baron signed the papers, the girls became entries in a ledger, described only by age, condition, and novelty: twin, healthy, unseparated. The words were written in clean ink, each letter precise, as though clarity on the page could justify the erasure taking place in real time. Inside the servants' quarters, the twins were ordered to stand still while their cloaks were removed and replaced with garments chosen for them. The fabric was coarse, dyed a dull color meant to hide dirt and wear. As the clothes changed, so did their identity. The last physical remnants of where they came from were folded away, discarded, or repurposed. A ribbon one of them had tied around her wrist was taken and tossed aside. A small carved token hidden in a seam was discovered and destroyed. These were seen as unnecessary attachments, signs of a past that no longer applied. What mattered now was usefulness and obedience. The twins did not cry out. They had learned long before this moment that sound could be dangerous. Instead, they communicated in glances, in the smallest shifts of posture, in breaths synchronized without conscious effort. Being identical had once made them special in their village, a source of wonder and affection. Here, it made them valuable in a different way. The symmetry of their faces drew comments from the servants assigned to prepare them, remarks spoken as if the girls could not understand, as if they were already less than human. The twins listened anyway, absorbing each word, each tone, storing information the way one might hide contraband. When they were finally led into the estate, the scale of the place overwhelmed them. High ceilings swallowed sound, corridors stretched longer than any path they had ever walked, and the smell of polished wood mixed with roasting meat and candle wax. They were instructed to walk in step, heads lowered, eyes forward. A single misstep earned a sharp correction, not violent but deliberate, meant to teach rather than punish. From the first moment, their bodies were being trained to respond without thought, to exist in service of someone else's will. The stripping of identity went beyond clothing and silence. They were given new names, simple and interchangeable, chosen not for meaning but for convenience. The Baron spoke them once, testing how they sounded, then nodded in satisfaction. The names erased any trace of who the girls had been to each other, to their parents, to themselves. The twins heard the syllables and understood that answering to them was now a requirement for survival. Refusal was not an option. Forgetting, however, would take longer. They were presented as objects, positioned carefully before the Baron's sons like fine horses or imported art. Their posture was adjusted, their faces turned toward the twins felt hands on their shoulders guiding, pressing, correcting. They were aware of being studied, evaluated, compared. The older son looked at them with curiosity edged with discomfort, as though unsure where to place his gaze. The younger smiled, fascinated by the idea that something living could belong to him entirely. Neither asked their names, neither thought to. The Baron spoke for them, explaining their value, their rarity, their purpose. In that moment, The girls understood that whatever they had been before no longer existed in the eyes of anyone present. They were twins. Nothing more. A matched set. Their individuality, already intertwined by birth, was further compressed into a single concept meant to be owned and controlled. The irony was cruel and complete. What had once bound them together as family was now being used to reduce them. After the presentation, they were separated, assigned to different parts of the household, despite the Baron's insistence that they remain unbroken as a pair in principle. The separation was practical, he claimed, a way to maximize efficiency. For the twins, it was the first test of their bond under this new reality. They were led down different corridors, their last shared glance heavy with unspoken promises. No words passed between them, but something settled, solid and unmovable, beneath the fear. Days passed, measured not by clocks but by tasks and commands. Each twin learned her assigned role quickly, mimicking others, listening closely, making herself useful. Mistakes were corrected swiftly, sometimes gently, sometimes not. Each correction reinforced the same lesson: your body is not your own, your time is not your own, even your thoughts must be guarded. The new names were repeated constantly, woven into orders and reprimands until they threatened to override memory. Still, in the quiet moments, each girl repeated her true name silently, like a prayer, refusing to let it disappear completely. At night, when the estate grew still, the twins found ways to reconnect. A brief encounter in a corridor, a shared glance across the courtyard, a hand brushing another's sleeve just long enough to confirm presence. These moments became acts of resistance, small but significant. The system had stripped them of language, history and choice, but it had not yet succeeded in breaking recognition. They still knew each other. They still existed as more than what had been assigned to them. The Baron believed the process was complete. In his mind, the twins had been successfully transformed from people into property. He saw obedience in their lowered eyes, efficiency in their movements, silence in their mouths. What he did not see were the memories preserved beneath that silence, the names held carefully in the dark, the identity reshaped rather than erased. He mistook compliance for surrender, forgetting that survival often wears the mask of submission, and that being stripped of everything can sharpen the will in ways power never anticipates. From the moment the twins were presented, the difference between the Baron's sons revealed itself in subtle but unmistakable ways. They stood side by side, similar in upbringing and privilege, yet divided by temperament and expectation. The older son observed first, his gaze cautious, almost analytical. He had grown up watching servants move silently through corridors, had absorbed the rules of ownership without ever fully questioning them. But something about seeing the girls so young, so visibly afraid, unsettled him. His discomfort did not rise to protest or refusal. It lingered instead as hesitation, as a pause. He did not know how to explain. He had been taught that enslaved people were assets, responsibilities passed down like land or title, yet the reality standing before him resisted abstraction. The younger son reacted differently. Where his brother paused, he leaned forward. His eyes moved eagerly over the twins, intrigued not by their fear but by the novelty of possession. To him, the idea of owning something living felt like a rite of passage, proof that he was stepping into the world of men. He smiled when the Baron spoke of loyalty and usefulness, when he explained how the girls would be trained, disciplined and shaped to serve. The younger son had not yet learned to hide enthusiasm behind restraint. His excitement was raw, unfiltered, and encouraged by a father who mistook it for strength. The Baron noticed both reactions and interpreted them according to his own belief. The older son's reserve was seen as seriousness, a thoughtful approach to responsibility. The younger son's eagerness was praised as confidence. In his mind, both responses validated the tradition. One son would rule with calculated authority, the other with assertive dominance. The twins, he believed, would serve as tools in this education, their lives shaping the character of the next generation just as surely as tutors and books. As the days passed, the son's interactions with the twins deepened these contrasts. The older son issued orders carefully, often through intermediaries, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate. He avoided unnecessary contact, spoke little, and observed more than he acted. When corrections were needed, he deferred to overseers, convincing himself that delegation absolved him of direct responsibility. In quiet moments, he watched the twins work, noting their efficiency, their silence, the way they seemed to anticipate commands before they were spoken. He told himself this was proof of proper training, yet the thought left him uneasy, as though something essential had been removed in the process. The younger son, by contrast, sought interaction. He gave commands directly, testing boundaries, watching for reaction. He took pleasure in the immediate response of obedience, in the way his voice alone could alter another person's movement. Sometimes he laughed,
Sometimes he grew irritated when the twins did not perform exactly as he expected. To him they were not individuals but reflections of his authority. Their sameness amused him. He treated them almost as interchangeable, calling one when the other was closer, unconcerned with the distinction. This casual erasure felt natural to him, reinforced by years of watching adults behave the same way. The twins sensed the difference immediately. With the older son they learned to remain invisible, efficient and silent. His approval came in the absence of correction, his displeasure in subtle changes of expression. With the younger son they learned vigilance. His moods shifted quickly, and his attention could turn from playful to cruel without warning. They adjusted their behavior accordingly, mirroring what was expected, storing observations, building an internal map of danger and safety. Survival demanded understanding not just orders but personalities. Despite his distance, the older son was not unaware of what ownership meant. Late at night when the estate quieted, fragments of memory surfaced, sermons about mercy, stories of saints who had given up wealth, lessons about justice, spoken by tutors who never questioned the system that paid them. These ideas clashed silently with the reality of his inheritance. He did not voice these thoughts, not even to himself in full sentences. They existed instead as discomfort, as a tension he resolved by doing nothing, by allowing tradition to carry him forward without resistance. The younger son experienced no such tension. His world was simple and clearly ordered. Father commanded, servants obeyed, and he stood somewhere in between, learning to command in turn. When he thought of the twins he thought of tasks they could perform, of ways they could be useful, of how their presence elevated his status among peers. He spoke of them openly, without hesitation, as possessions. His confidence was rewarded with approval, reinforcing the idea that empathy was unnecessary, even undesirable. The Baron watched these developments with satisfaction. To him the twins were fulfilling their purpose. They were teaching lessons no book could convey, lessons about control, hierarchy and entitlement. He did not consider the cost of these lessons, nor did he notice the subtle shifts taking place within his household. He did not see how the older son's silence masked growing doubt, or how the younger son's enthusiasm sharpened into something harder and more dangerous. He believed the system was working exactly as intended. Within this dynamic, the twins became mirrors, reflecting back the nature of those who claimed to own them. The older son saw in them a reminder of responsibilities he did not know how to reconcile. The younger son saw confirmation of his power. Neither saw them fully as human beings, yet the differences in their reactions created cracks in the certainty the Baron relied upon. These cracks were small, barely visible, but they existed, shaped by the simple truth that witnessing injustice does not affect everyone in the same way, even when all are raised to accept it.
Before the world taught them fear, the twins had learned each other. Their earliest memories were not of places or faces but of presence. The constant awareness that they were never alone. They shared breath in the dark, shared warmth when nights turned cold, shared laughter that confused adults who could never tell which girl had begun it. Long before words there was recognition. A glance was enough. A shift of weight, a pause, a tightening of fingers carried meaning. This silent language shaped by years of closeness did not disappear when they were taken. It adapted, folding itself inward, becoming quieter, sharper, more necessary. On the estate this bond became their first defense. When speech was dangerous and names were stolen, they relied on what could not be easily taken. In the presence of overseers and masters their faces remained still, expressions carefully controlled. Yet within that stillness signals passed. A lowered eyelid warned of approaching footsteps. A slight tilt of the head meant wait. The rhythm of their movements aligned unconsciously, each anticipating the other's pace. To those watching it appeared as obedience. In truth it was coordination. Separation tested this bond, but it did not break it. Though assigned to different duties, the twins sought each other in the margins of the day. They learned the patterns of the household, the moments when corridors were empty, when eyes were elsewhere. A glance across a courtyard confirmed survival. A shared task in the kitchen became a moment of exchange, hands brushing just long enough to communicate reassurance. These brief contacts carried the weight of entire conversations, reminding each twin that the other still existed, still remembered. In the absence of spoken names they created new markers of identity known only to them. A particular way of tying a cloth, a habit of standing with weight on a certain foot, a pattern of knocks against wood. These small details anchored them to themselves and to each other. They were not interchangeable, no matter how the household treated them. Each twin knew the other's habits intimately, recognized fatigue, sensed fear before it showed. This awareness allowed them to adjust, to compensate when one was weaker, to draw strength from shared endurance. Their bond was not only emotional but strategic. Together they observed. They noticed which servants were kind, which were cruel, which could be trusted to look away. They memorized routines, cataloged rules, identified inconsistencies. Information gathered by one was silently passed to the other. Over time, this shared knowledge formed a map of survival. They learned when to comply fully, when to slow a task just enough to avoid attention, when to disappear into the background. Each decision was made with the other in mind, an unspoken agreement that survival was collective, not individual. Pain, when it came, was also shared. When one was punished, the other felt it, carrying the weight silently, absorbing the lesson without needing to experience it directly. This reduced risk, limited exposure, and strengthened their resolve. They did not romanticize suffering. They adapted to it, learned from it, and used it to protect each other. Their bond transformed fear into focus, grief into vigilance. At night, when the estate settled into uneasy quiet, the twins retreated inward. Each lay awake in separate spaces, staring into darkness, replaying the day. In these moments, memory became refuge. They recalled fragments of their past not as nostalgia but as preservation. A shared song hummed silently, a rhythm tapped against a thigh, a phrase repeated internally. These memories were not escape but reinforcement, proof that their existence extended beyond the present conditions. Knowing that the other carried the same memories made them harder to erase. The household underestimated this bond because it did not understand it. To the Baron and his sons, the twins' closeness was a novelty at most, an aesthetic curiosity. They assumed that separation, discipline, and routine would dissolve it over time. They believed identity could be stripped away through control and repetition. What they failed to grasp was that identity forged in relationship does not rely on permission. It survives in absence, grows stronger under pressure, and adapts to confinement. The twins learned to use the perception of sameness to their advantage. When one was expected but the other appeared, confusion followed. Small mistakes by those in authority created opportunity. An order given to the wrong twin was still an order, but its execution could be altered, delayed, or redirected. They never exploited this recklessly. Each adjustment was calculated, designed to remain invisible. Their bond allowed them to anticipate each other's movements, so precisely that substitution went unnoticed. Trust between them was absolute. There was no need to question motives, no fear of betrayal. In a world structured around domination and suspicion, this trust was rare and dangerous. It made them resilient. When despair threatened one, the other compensated, carrying hope forward. When exhaustion dulled senses, the other remained alert. Their strength was not in dramatic acts but in consistency, in the refusal to let isolation define them. Over time, their bond began to influence others, though few could name it. Servants noticed how the twins moved, how they seemed to understand tasks before instructions were finished. Some felt uneasy, others curious. Whispers followed, not of rebellion but of something harder to control. The twins did not seek attention. They sought continuity, the preservation of self through shared existence. What the estate saw as obedience was, in reality, coordination rooted in love, loyalty, and an unspoken vow that no matter what was taken from them, they would remain whole together. Life inside the estate followed a rhythm designed to erase hesitation and reward predictability. The day began before dawn, long before the sun stirred or the Baron rang for breakfast. Bells or shouted commands pulled servants from thin sleep, bodies rising automatically, minds already calculating the tasks ahead. For the twins, mornings were lessons in speed and silence. They learned how quickly to dress, how to move without drawing attention, how to blend into the flow of labor that kept the household functioning. Every delay was noted, every deviation corrected, not always with punishment, but with reminders that efficiency was survival. Rules governed every aspect of existence. Though many were never written or spoken aloud, they were absorbed through observation, reinforced through repetition. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not meet a master's eyes. Do not linger in one place. Do not ask questions. Some rules contradicted others, forcing constant vigilance. Initiative could be praised one day and punished the next. The twins learned to read tone, posture, and timing, adjusting behavior accordingly. This uncertainty was intentional, a method of control that kept servants off balance, dependent on approval that could be withdrawn without explanation. The estate itself enforced these rules through its architecture. Corridors narrowed unexpectedly, staircases twisted, doors locked from the outside. Certain rooms were forbidden without permission, their entrances marked not by signs but by consequence. The twins memorized these boundaries quickly,
noting which thresholds could be crossed safely and which could not. Even the gardens were divided, open paths reserved for the family, hidden routes used by servants to remain unseen. Movement was choreographed, each body assigned a place within the larger mechanism. Meals highlighted the hierarchy clearly. Food was abundant in the main hall, served warm and seasoned, accompanied by conversation and laughter. In the servants' quarters, meals were functional, eaten quickly, often standing. The twins learned to eat without waste, to accept whatever was placed before them. Hunger was common, not always from lack of food but from exhaustion that dulled appetite or schedules that did not allow for rest. Complaints were unheard of, swallowed along with thin broth and coarse bread. Training was constant, woven into daily tasks. An overseer demonstrated how to polish floors until reflections appeared, how to carry trays without spilling, how to fold linens with precise corrections were immediate. Praise was rare. The twins adapted quickly, understanding that competence reduced scrutiny. They learned that invisibility was safety. The better they performed, the less they were noticed, the fewer opportunities for discipline. This lesson shaped their movements, making them efficient, quiet and difficult to single out. Discipline, when it came, was calculated, rarely impulsive. It was meant to instruct rather than vent anger. A public reprimand reminded others of consequence. A private correction reinforced obedience without spectacle. The twins observed how punishment varied depending on who was watching, who was being corrected, and who was issuing the order. They stored this information carefully, using it to predict outcome. Fear became a tool they managed rather than something that overwhelmed them. Rest was minimal and conditional. Nights offered limited reprieve, bodies collapsing onto narrow beds, minds still alert. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by noise or worry. Dreams carried echoes of past and present, blending memory with anxiety. The twins learned to wake instantly, ready to respond. Fatigue became a constant companion, shaping thoughts and reactions. Yet even exhaustion had to be hidden. Signs of weakness invited attention, and attention invited correction. Social interaction among servants was regulated as well. Conversations were brief, cautious, often coded. Trust was earned slowly. Some servants offered guidance quietly, teaching the twins which tasks to avoid, which people to fear, which moments allowed brief relief. Others kept distance, protecting themselves by limiting association. The twins navigated this carefully, forming connections without drawing notice, learning the unspoken politics of the household. Religion was present, but distorted. Prayers were recited, hymns sung, sermons attended by the family while servants listened from the edge. Messages of obedience and order were emphasized, compassion framed as charity bestowed from above. The twins listened without comment, noting the contrast between words and actions. Faith became another rule to observe rather than a refuge, its language used to justify hierarchy and discipline. Time lost its usual meaning within these walls. Days blurred together, marked by tasks rather than dates. The twins measured time through changes in light, through the rhythm of bells, through the wear on their hands. Seasons passed subtly, signaled by shifts in duties and clothing. This monotony was part of the system, discouraging reflection, narrowing focus to immediate survival. Long-term thinking felt dangerous, yet the twins maintained it quietly, storing moments and observations, waiting. Despite the rigidity, the system was not perfect. Human error created gaps. An overseer distracted, a rule forgotten, a moment when attention drifted. The twins learned to recognize these openings without exploiting them openly. They used them to breathe, to exchange glances, to confirm presence. The rules were meant to break spirit, to reduce life to function. But within that structure, the twins found ways to exist fully, even if invisibly. The estate believed control was complete because order appeared intact. Tasks were performed, silence maintained, hierarchy respected. What it did not see was the inner life persisting beneath routine, the constant awareness shaping every movement, the quiet resistance embedded in adaptation. The rules were designed to define existence entirely, yet they also revealed the limits of control, the spaces where thought remained free, where identity continued to form, where endurance quietly challenged the system meant to contain it. The act itself was so small that it almost disappeared into the routine of the day. It was not loud, not dramatic, not meant to be seen. In a household where obedience was measured in silence and efficiency, the smallest deviation carried weight. The twins understood this instinctively. Defiance, if it were to exist at all, had to be subtle enough to blend into normality, gentle enough to pass as mistake, patient enough to avoid suspicion. What they chose to do did not break any obvious rule. And that was precisely what made it dangerous. It began during a task so ordinary it barely registered. One twin was assigned to deliver folded linens to a storage room near the east wing, a place frequented by servants and rarely visited by the family. The other, scheduled elsewhere, adjusted her pace just enough to pass through the same corridor moments later. Their timing was deliberate but invisible, learned through observation rather than instruction. When the first twin reached the storage room, she placed the linens on the shelf as expected. What she did next took less than a second. She shifted one stack slightly to the left, creating a small gap, then stepped away. Minutes later, the second twin entered under the pretense of checking inventory. She slid a folded cloth into the gap, identical in appearance to the others, indistinguishable, unless someone knew exactly what to look for. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. The shelves remained neat, the room orderly, yet within that space now existed something new, a shared point of reference, a place altered by intention rather than instruction. This was not theft, not sabotage, not refusal. It was coordination. The twins had created a signal only they would recognize. The shifted stack became a marker, a way to communicate presence and timing without words or contact. If the cloth remained, it meant safety. If it disappeared, it meant danger or interference. The system relied on the assumption that servants acted only in response to commands, that they did not initiate patterns of their own. This small act challenged that assumption quietly, without provoking immediate response. The risk lay not in the action itself, but in the mindset behind it. The twins were no longer merely adapting to rules. They were shaping their environment, however slightly. They were testing the boundaries of invisibility, learning how much they could alter without drawing notice. Each repetition of the act reinforced confidence, not arrogance, but awareness. They observed how long the marker remained untouched, who entered the room, how often shelves were checked. Information accumulated, piece by piece. As days passed, the act expanded incrementally. The cloth moved position depending on circumstance. Sometimes it was folded differently, sometimes placed higher or lower. Each variation carried meaning agreed upon without discussion. One adjustment signaled that an overseer was nearby, another meant that schedules had changed. The twins never altered more than one thing at a time. Excess invited attention, precision ensured survival. What made this act powerful was its ordinariness. The household was filled with movement, with constant rearrangement of objects, with endless tasks that required shifting, stacking, cleaning. Change was expected, but intention was not. The twins hid intention inside expectation, using routine as camouflage. Their defiance did not announce itself. It lived quietly within compliance, feeding on predictability. Other servants noticed nothing at first. Even those who worked nearby saw only what they expected to see. Order remained intact. Tasks were completed. Silence held. Yet something subtle began to change. The twins moved with slightly more confidence, their coordination tightening. They anticipated disruptions before they occurred. They avoided certain areas at precisely the right moment. This efficiency appeared commendable, even admirable. Praise, rare as it was, followed. The system rewarded the very behavior that undermined its assumptions. The Baron and his sons remained unaware. To them, the twins were settling into their roles perfectly. Productivity and errors decreased. There was no reason to question success. The small act did not register as rebellion, because it did not fit the image of rebellion they recognized. It was not loud, not violent, not defiant in posture or speech. It was patient, observant, adaptive. For the twins, the act carried emotional weight beyond its practical use. It was proof that they could still choose, still decide, still shape something together. In a world that denied them agency, this choice mattered deeply. It reminded them that obedience was a performance, not an identity. The shelves became a shared space of control, however limited. Knowing it existed, altered how they moved through the estate. Fear did not disappear, but it sharpened into focus. They understood the danger of escalation. Each act had to remain within the margin of plausibility. They resisted the temptation to do more, to test limits too quickly. Patience was part of the defiance. They waited, watched, adjusted. The act remained invisible precisely because it respected the boundaries of the system while quietly bending. Eventually, the small change began to influence decisions beyond the twins. A servant avoided a corridor at the right moment after following their lead unconsciously. A task was delayed just enough to prevent an encounter with an overseer in a bad mood. These effects were not planned, but they were noted. The twins saw how intention could ripple outward without announcement. They learned that control systems often failed, not because of open resistance, but because of accumulated unnoticed adjustments. The estate thrived on predictability. Its rules assumed linear behavior, direct cause and effect. The Twins Act introduced complexity without visibility. It created a layer of meaning beneath the surface of routine, a quiet network of awareness. Those in power remained confident, because nothing appeared to challenge them. That confidence was their weakness. What began as a simple shift of cloth evolved into a method of thinking. The twins applied the same principle elsewhere, always cautiously, always within expectation. A door left slightly ajar, a tool placed where it would be found later, a task completed in a particular order. None of these actions violated rules directly. Together, they formed a pattern of subtle influence. The most dangerous aspect of the act was not that it broke a rule, but that it proved rules could be navigated, reinterpreted and used without permission. It showed that even within strict control, choice persisted. The estate remained unaware because it measured obedience only by surface behavior. It did not account for intention, for coordination, for the quiet assertion of will, embedded in routine. The twins did not celebrate this act. They treated it with seriousness, with restraint. They understood that survival depended on remaining unseen. Yet beneath that restraint, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer only reacting to the system. They were interacting with it, learning its blind spots, testing its limits gently, patiently, one unnoticed adjustment at a time.
Secrets existed in the estate long before the twins arrived, layered into its walls like rot hidden beneath polish. They were not spoken of openly, not written down, but they shaped behavior as surely as any rule. The twins learned to sense them before they understood them, noticing the way voices lowered in certain corridors, how some doors were never left unattended, how certain names caused servants to glance around before responding. The estate appeared orderly, predictable, but beneath that surface ran currents of fear and compromise. At first, the secrets revealed themselves through routine. One twin noticed that deliveries to the West Wing were always made by the same small group of servants, rotated carefully, as though trust there was limited and guarded. The other observed that cleaning in the Baron's private study followed a different schedule, rushed and irregular, overseen personally rather than delegated. These patterns did not match efficiency, they matched concealment. The twins did not comment, not even to each other in words. They marked the inconsistencies and waited. Over time, fragments emerged. A ledger left open too long, pages filled with figures that did not align with visible trade. A conversation cut short when footsteps approached. A servant who disappeared suddenly, his absence explained vaguely and never discussed again. The twins learned that silence was not always obedience. Sometimes it was fear sharpened by knowledge. They watched who avoided whom, who drank more than necessary, who prayed too loudly. Each detail added depth to the unseen structure governing the household. The estate's wealth, often celebrated, carried shadows. Shipments arrived at odd hours, bypassing normal inspection. Boxes were stored temporarily in unused rooms before being moved again. Destinations undisclosed. The twins were never assigned directly to these tasks, but they saw enough to understand that legality was flexible within these walls. The Baron's authority extended beyond land and servants. It reached into networks that thrived on discretion. This knowledge altered how the twins viewed power. It was not absolute. It was negotiated, protected by secrecy rather than righteousness. One afternoon, while polishing a cabinet in a rarely used sitting room, a twin discovered a loose panel. Inside were documents wrapped carefully in oilcloth, edges worn from handling. She did not read them fully. She did not need to. The presence alone mattered. She replaced the panel exactly as she found it, heart steady, movements controlled. Later, a glance exchanged in the corridor conveyed everything. They had found something that was not meant to be found. The discovery did not make them reckless. It made them careful. They began to notice how the Baron's behavior shifted when certain topics arose, how his confidence tightened into vigilance. He was powerful, but he was also guarding something. This awareness reframed everything. Control was not just imposed downward, it was maintained sideways through alliances and silence. The twins understood that fear existed above them as well as below. Other servants held pieces of these secrets too, though none spoke openly. An older woman in the laundry room warned one twin away from a particular stairwell without explanation. A groundskeeper lingered near the gate on certain nights, eyes alert, posture tense. These were not acts of kindness alone, they were acts of self-preservation. The twins recognized this, and responded with the same discretion. Trust, when it formed, was cautious and conditional. The sons, too, were touched by secrets, though differently. The older son avoided certain rooms without being told to. The younger repeated phrases he had heard without understanding their weight. The twins observed these behaviors, noting how knowledge and ignorance shaped authority. The older son's restraint now appeared less like hesitation and more like awareness. He knew enough to be cautious, not enough to act. The younger knew nothing, and feared nothing, a combination that made him dangerous. The most unsettling realization came gradually. The twins began to see how their own presence intersected with these secrets. They were not just servants, they were witnesses. Their movements brought them into spaces others avoided. Their silence made them easy to forget. This invisibility granted access. They passed through rooms where conversations had just ended, handled objects meant to be unseen, overheard fragments meant to be lost. The system assumed they absorbed nothing. That assumption was its flaw. The twins did not seek leverage. They sought understanding. Each secret uncovered added context, explained inconsistencies, revealed motivations. They learned why certain rules were enforced strictly while others were ignored. They saw how punishment could be delayed or redirected depending on circumstances. They understood that morality in this house was less about right and wrong than about exposure and concealment. Fear accompanied this knowledge, but it was not paralyzing. It was clarifying. The twins became more precise in their movements, more disciplined in their silence. They knew now that mistakes could resonate beyond immediate consequences. A misplaced object, a repeated phrase, a glance held too long could draw attention not just to them but to things hidden behind them. Responsibility expanded quietly. The estate's greatest secret was not a single crime or document, but the fragility of its authority. It relied on silence from those who knew too much and ignorance from those who knew too little. The twins existed between these states, accumulating understanding without acknowledgement. They carried this knowledge carefully, like a weight distributed evenly between them. In the evenings when paths crossed briefly, a look was enough to convey new information. A raised brow meant something had shifted. A slow blink meant caution. Their silent language adapted to this deeper awareness, expanding to include not just survival but comprehension. They were no longer only navigating rules, they were navigating truths. What the Baron could not see was that secrets once discovered do not remain static. They influence perception, reshape choices, alter balance. The twins did not expose anything, they did not confront anyone, they simply knew, and that knowing changed how they stood, how they listened, how they waited. Aware now that beneath the estate's rigid order lay a network of hidden vulnerabilities, threads pulled tight by fear, threads that could unravel not through force but through the quiet persistence of those who had learned to see without being seen. The decision came quietly, almost imperceptibly. As the house settled into the rhythm of a winter night, the Baron had long since retired to his private chambers, the sons to theirs, and most of the servants to their small cold quarters. Only a few remained in the corridors or kitchens, finishing tasks that could not wait for daylight. The twins had completed their assigned chores hours earlier, yet they lingered, eyes scanning the familiar paths, ears attuned to the faintest shifts in sound. They understood instinctively that the night offered opportunity, though it carried risk greater than any they had faced before. The choice to act was not sudden, not born of impulse. It was the culmination of months of observation, of memorized patterns, of understanding where control faltered. Each day had taught them the limits of authority and the spaces where it could be bent without breaking out. The household relied on predictability, footsteps in the right order, lights extinguished at expected times, trays delivered before anyone noticed absence. The twins had internalized these rhythms so completely that they could move within them as though invisible. That night, they resolved to test their own capabilities, to assert agency in a way that had never before been attempted. Their plan was small in appearance, but vast in consequence. It did not involve confrontation, no overt challenge to authority, no theft or sabotage. It relied on subtlety, on timing, on the kind of precision that only comes from intimate knowledge of one's environment. The twins moved separately at first, each ensuring that the spaces they would occupy were clear, each confirming that those who might witness were distracted or absent. Even the smallest sound, a squeak of wood, a shift of clothing, a cough could betray them. Silence, they knew, was both shield and weapon. As they converged, each twin carried a fragment of what was necessary. They had coordinated through glances earlier in the day, through slight adjustments in routine that observers would dismiss as habitual. One twin had positioned objects in particular places, creating markers, while the other adjusted timing and movement to ensure synchron. Their shared understanding, unspoken and instantaneous, allowed them to act together without speaking, without hesitation, without drawing attention. The act depended on this bond, and without it,
failure would have been immediate and severe. When the moment arrived, they executed with the precision of those who had rehearsed countless contingencies in their minds. One twin moved toward the west wing ostensibly to check on stored linens, while the other navigated the corridors near the main. Their paths intersected at points predicted by earlier observation, allowing subtle exchange of signals and verification that each was proceeding as intended. The estate's rules, designed to control every motion, were bent around them without anyone noticing. They moved as shadows, present yet unnoticed, performing tasks with purpose invisible to authority. Every detail mattered. Doors were left slightly ajar to allow passage, trays were aligned precisely to avoid detection, shadows were used to mask movement. The twins relied on each other's awareness of their surroundings, each adjusting posture, pace and gaze to complement the other. Their actions were deliberate but unhurried, designed to blend seamlessly into the household's routine. To an observer, nothing appeared unusual. The house seemed unchanged, ordered and obedient. In reality, the twins were reshaping the very space in which control was exercised. Their decision required constant calculation. Each step involved assessing risk, the likelihood of being seen, the potential consequences, the degree of attention given by overseers or family members. They had learned that authority often depended on perception rather than action, that visibility could be manipulated, and that subtle shifts could achieve outcomes impossible through direct confrontation. This understanding transformed ordinary movement into strategic maneuver. Every corridor became a chessboard, every door a tactical obstacle, every passing footfall a signal. The emotional weight of the act was profound. Courage was not a loud declaration but a quiet acknowledgement that they would act despite fear. Each twin felt the strain of possibility, punishment, discovery, reprisal, but they also felt the exhilaration of asserting some measure of control over their lives. The risk was personal but also collective. Failure would impact both, yet success would validate months of careful preparation. They relied on the unspoken bond that had sustained them through separation, hardship and daily labor, trusting that coordination could overcome the mechanisms designed to suppress them. Even as they moved, their senses were heightened. The sound of creaking floorboards, the distant voices of servants, the faint glow of candlelight, all became data points in an ongoing assessment. One twin noticed a shadow near the staircase, and adjusted her pace. The other saw a tray being carried too quickly and modified her path accordingly. These small recalibrations occurred in real time, an unbroken dialogue of motion and awareness. The twins were engaged not only in the act itself, but in constant adaptation, responding to the unpredictable, while maintaining the integrity of their plan. By the time the key action was complete, they had altered the household in ways that were invisible yet irrevocable. A sequence of objects, a shift in timing, a signal passed undetected. These minor changes carried significance beyond immediate perception. They had demonstrated in practice that rules could be navigated, authority could be challenged, and space could be controlled without breaking the surface order. The night had become a laboratory, the twins both experimenters and instruments, testing the boundaries of obedience and survival simultaneously. Exhaustion was immediate yet secondary. Adrenaline carried them through the final moments, and only when they returned to separate quarters did the weight of tension settle into limbs and minds. Even then, vigilance persisted. They did not speak of what had occurred, did not celebrate, did not allow themselves relief. The act had to remain invisible, its significance muted to preserve safety. Awareness of consequence tempered every reaction. Success depended on continued discretion. The twins' decision on that night was more than an isolated instance of defiance. It represented a shift in their perception of themselves and their environment. They had moved from passive adaptation to active engagement, from silent compliance to strategic action. Each small maneuver carried lessons for future challenges, reinforcing the understanding that authority could be manipulated subtly, that survival could include agency, and that knowledge, observation and coordination were as powerful as obedience. This was the first time they had acted with such deliberate independence, and it carried implications that would extend far beyond that winter night. The household continued its rhythm unaware of the quiet upheaval, yet within it, the twins had changed the rules by which they exist. They had demonstrated that even within the strictest confines, possibility remained, that initiative could exist beneath the surface of order, and that courage, measured and patient, could reshape the balance of power without a single word spoken. The Baron had always believed that his control over the estate was absolute, that his wealth, lineage and authority guaranteed obedience from all who lived within his walls. He had structured his household meticulously, assigning roles, duties and hierarchies designed to leave no room for error or resistance. Every corridor, every room, every routine served a purpose, creating a web of order that reinforced his supremacy. Yet, as the days and nights passed after the twins' arrival, subtle disruptions began to ripple through the estate, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but impossible to ignore for those attuned to precision. It began with minor anomalies. Tasks that were normally completed in strict sequence were delayed slightly. Objects arranged with meticulous care appeared shifted, only just enough to be noticed by those who looked closely. Servants muttered under their breath, or glanced quickly down corridors, unsure why timing had faltered. These changes were minute, and on the surface they appeared as human error, but the Baron, whose attention to detail was renowned, began to sense a pattern that unsettled him. His eyes, trained to detect deviation, noticed hesitation, adjustment, and synchronization in movements that should have been automatic. The twins' presence was central to this disruption. They moved silently, purposefully, coordinating in ways that rendered their actions invisible, yet effective. The Baron's sons, accustomed to seeing compliance as obedience, failed to detect the nuances. The older son, with his habit of measured reserve, noticed anomalies but attributed them to fatigue or oversight. The younger son, more impulsive and less perceptive, ignored inconsistencies entirely, focused instead on asserting control where he believed it mattered. Yet between them, the twins' subtle manipulations continued, altering the household without confrontation, their influence like a quiet current beneath the surface of daily life. As the Baron observed, unease grew. He had always assumed that order equaled control. That assumption, long unchallenged, was being tested in ways that could not be measured by punishment or reward. He began to notice small things, objects, returned slightly differently than arranged, doors left ajar for a fraction longer than expected, servants appearing at locations slightly out of schedule. Each minor inconsistency felt like a ripple in the fabric of authority he had so carefully constructed. He could not pinpoint a cause, could not find a culprit, and that uncertainty eroded his confidence. The twins' ability to act together without detection was key. Their bond allowed instantaneous communication through glance, gesture, or rhythm, creating a system of coordination that was invisible to others. They anticipated each other's movements, adjusted to changes, and exploited gaps in oversight. In essence, they had created an invisible network of influence within the estate, one that functioned independently of authority. The Baron assumed compliance, because he saw outward obedience, yet the inner logic of his household was subtly being rewritten by the twins' coordinated action. As the anomalies continued, suspicion began to surface. The Baron questioned servants more frequently, tested the sons' awareness, and inspected rooms with increasing scrutiny. He demanded explanations, citing protocol and order, yet found none sufficient. Servants, nervous under scrutiny, offered excuses that ranged from distraction to fatigue, but the Baron sensed a tension in the air he could not account for. He had always maintained that fear and authority ensured compliance, yet here, compliance appeared perfect, while the underlying structure shifted in ways beyond his control. The twins watched this growing unease carefully. They did not seek confrontation, nor did they attempt to manipulate the Baron directly. Instead, they continued with their subtle coordination, adapting to heightened attention while maintaining the integrity of their system. Each action was measured, deliberate, and designed to remain untraceable. The more the Baron tried to impose authority, the more opportunities emerged for minor adjustments. As his scrutiny inadvertently created predictable patterns they could exploit, even the sons began to be affected, though different. The older son, whose natural reserve had kept him distant, found himself questioning routine in ways he never had. Small anomalies made him pause, recalibrate, and observe more closely. The younger son, still confident in his untested authority, became frustrated when expectations were not met precisely. These reactions, subtle as they were, further amplified the effectiveness of the twins' coordination. Authority fractured not through rebellion but through perception and anticipation. Within this environment, the twins' internal communication became increasingly sophisticated. They developed a system of markers, gestures, and objects that allowed information to pass without detection. A misaligned tray, a folded cloth slightly askew, a step timed fractionally differently all carried meaning. These signals guided action, conveyed observation, and allowed adjustments in real time. Their influence extended beyond the immediate moment, shaping behavior, controlling risk, and ensuring survival while remaining imperceptible to those invested in maintaining order. The Baron, despite his power, could not fully comprehend what was occurring. He interpreted outward appearances as evidence that control remained intact, failing to recognize the depth of the disruption beneath the surface. His authority, previously unchallenged, was being subtly undermined without overt defiance. Every inspection, every question, every attempt to reinforce hierarchy only highlighted his inability to perceive invisible coordination. The twins' actions demonstrated that control based solely on observation and fear was inherently limited when confronted with intelligence, patience, and bond. As the days continued, the estate became a theater of invisible maneuvering. The twins moved through it like currents beneath ice, adapting to every change, anticipating responses, and remaining undetected. The Baron's frustration increased as patterns of disruption persisted without explanation. The twins' success did not rely on power, weapons, or direct confrontation. It relied on observation, knowledge, and coordination. Their subtle actions revealed the fragility of a system built on obedience alone. This quiet shift had consequences beyond immediate logistic. Authority, when undermined in ways that were invisible, began to lose its psychological hold. The Baron's confidence waned, and with it the perceived infallibility of hierarchy. Servants noticed tension, sons observed hesitation, and even the broader household atmosphere shifted. What had seemed immutable, the Baron's dominance, the son's authority, the unquestioned structure of daily life, was revealed to be conditional, dependent on perception, and vulnerable to subtle influence. The twins' coordination continued to evolve in response to these conditions. They adjusted to scrutiny, adapted to new schedules, and refined their signals. Each move was a lesson, teaching them not only how to survive, but how authority could be manipulated. They discovered that compliance could coexist with agency, that obedience in appearance need not preclude influence, and that even the most rigid system had gaps when observed closely and exploited carefully. By the time the Baron realized that control was slipping, he had already lost the ability to identify its source. What appeared to be ordinary compliance masked a network of subtle, intentional actions that were beyond immediate perception. Authority, long assumed to be absolute, was now conditional, tested by intelligence, observation, and the bond of two individuals, whose quiet persistence had begun to reshape the estate itself. The realization struck slowly, insidious. Control, the Baron understood, was not merely the sum of commands issued, and orders followed. It was perception, belief, and the alignment of those within the system. When even the smallest threads of coordination went unnoticed, authority began to unravel. And in the case of the twins, the threads were both invisible and unbreakable, sustained by a bond stronger than chains, a knowledge deeper than fear, and an understanding of the estate that exceeded what the Baron had ever intended to teach.
By the time the act of subtle defiance had fully taken shape, the twins had transformed from passive survivors into architects of influence within the estate. Their movements, once dictated entirely by routine and command, now carried intentionality. Every corridor, staircase, and chamber became a landscape of possibility, each shadow a potential tool, each sound a signal. They understood that survival was no longer merely a matter of obedience. It was a matter of adaptation, of reading patterns, and of creating opportunities that were invisible to those who assumed control was unassailable. The Baron, confident in the absolute hierarchy he had constructed, continued to issue commands, observe performance, and enforce discipline, yet the twins' quiet coordination was imperceptible on the surface. They complied fully with expectations, their tasks completed efficiently, their presence unobtrusive. To an outsider, nothing seemed amiss. The Baron praised diligence, the sons nodded at apparent obedience, and other servants observed the twins' movements as models of efficiency. Beneath this illusion, however, the twins had introduced a new variable into the system, agency cloaked as compliance. Each day they refined their methods. Simple adjustments became complex signals, tiny manipulations of objects, timing and position conveying information and coordinating action. A folded cloth, left slightly misaligned, could indicate that the corridor was safe to traverse. A broom leaning against a door in a certain way could mark a nearby overseer's presence. Movements became a silent dialogue between the twins, instantaneous and precise, a language that required no words and left no evidence. Their understanding of the estate, honed through months of observation, enabled them to exploit gaps in oversight, to navigate risk, and to expand influence without detection. Even the son's interactions played into this system. The older son, cautious and reserved, sometimes unwittingly created openings by his hesitation, his calculated distance leaving gaps in supervision that the twins could exploit. The younger son, more impulsive and less aware, generated chaos that could be predicted, turning mistakes and distractions into opportunities. Each behavior, each lapse in perception, became part of the twins' growing map of control. They were no longer only reacting, they were shaping the environment, learning the patterns of authority, and subtly rewriting them to preserve freedom where none was supposed to exist. The emotional dimension of this transformation was significant. Where fear had once dominated, a sense of purpose began to emerge. Each successful maneuver reinforced confidence, teaching the twins that intellect and observation could counteract power. They realized that obedience was a mask, a tool to navigate danger, and that beneath compliance lay the capacity to influence outcomes in ways unseen. This understanding did not diminish vigilance, rather it heightened awareness. Every action required calculation, every movement had consequences, and every decision had to account for the balance between exposure and opportunity. Physical endurance was intertwined with mental acuity. The long hours, the exhaustion, the constant risk, all sharpened perception. The twins learned to sense patterns in behavior, to anticipate movements before commands were spoken, and to adjust in real time. A footstep on a distant staircase, a faint creak of a door, the shift in candlelight, each became data points to navigate and manipulate. They developed a rhythm of survival that allowed them to maintain the appearance of passivity while exerting subtle influence across the estate. Their coordination became increasingly sophisticated, expanding beyond immediate survival to strategic manipulation. For example, when one twin was tasked with cleaning the main hall, she adjusted her pace slightly to create a window for the other to move undetected through a corridor that was usually monitored. Small shifts in timing or placement allowed them to exchange objects, messages or signals without drawing attention. These actions were invisible, yet their consequences were cumulative, gradually creating a network of influence that no member of the household could perceive. Trust between the twins remained absolute, reinforced by necessity. Every decision required complete confidence in the other's judgment. Every maneuver relied on shared understanding without verbal confirmation. This bond was more than emotional, it was tactical. It allowed them to synchronize movements, anticipate reactions, and respond to unforeseen changes with precision. Where others depended on authority or fear, the twins depended on mutual knowledge and coordination, a network impervious to detection because it existed entirely within. The broader implications of this shift were profound, though invisible to those in power. Authority, long assumed to be absolute, was revealed to be conditional, vulnerable to perception, and susceptible to subtle manipulation. The Baron's control, built on surveillance, discipline, and obedience, could not account for intelligence exercised quietly and strategically. The son's understanding of authority, similarly limited, failed to anticipate subtle coordination, revealing the fragility inherent in a system that equated compliance with submission. The twins' actions, while small in appearance, demonstrated a principle larger than themselves. Power is not absolute. When knowledge and coordination exist beneath the surface, their influence did not rely on confrontation or violence, but on subtlety, patience, and understanding. Each day they tested boundaries, learning how much control could be exerted without notice, how authority could be navigated without defiance being recognized, and how survival could coexist with agency. Every successful maneuver reinforced their confidence and sharpened their awareness. They began to anticipate not just immediate consequences, but the ripple effects of subtle shifts. A tray moved slightly, a cloth folded differently, or a corridor traversed at a specific moment became part of an ongoing system of signals and responses. This network extended their influence, allowing them to operate within the estate as though invisible, while simultaneously asserting a degree of control that no one suspected. The psychological weight of this knowledge was profound. The twins carried awareness of their own capability, of the fragility of perceived authority, and of the subtle levers they could manipulate. Fear remained, but it was tempered by understanding. They realized that power, while imposing, could be navigated intelligently. Authority could be undermined silently, rules could be bent without breaking them, and survival did not preclude agency. As weeks passed, the system became second nature. The twins moved through the estate with precision, using gestures, objects, and timing to communicate and coordinate. Their actions, though invisible, altered the household subtly but irreversibly. Tasks were performed differently, patterns of oversight shifted, and small inefficiencies emerged, all without anyone perceiving intentionality. Their silent influence reshaped the environment, demonstrating that control imposed through fear and observation alone could not account for intelligence exercised quietly and strategically. The Baron remained unaware, confident in the appearance of order. He praised diligence, assumed obedience, and overlooked the subtle currents beneath the surface. The sons, each in their own way, reinforced the twins' capacity to operate undetected. The older, through cautious oversight that created gaps, the younger through impulsiveness that introduced predictable chaos. Authority, thought to be unassailable,
was quietly being rewritten. By acting with deliberate intelligence, patience and coordination, the twins had accomplished what seemed impossible within the rigid confines of the estate. They demonstrated that influence need not be visible to be real, that survival could coexist with agency, and that knowledge, observation and bond could counteract even the strictest authority. Their subtle, persistent actions had begun to change the household in ways that would ripple outward, shaping the perception, behavior and understanding of those in power, without ever being openly acknowledged. The story of the twins culminates not in dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet revolution of intellect, courage and unbreakable bond. What they achieved was more powerful than defiance through force. It was defiance through awareness. They showed that even in the harshest systems of control, agency could survive, adapt and quietly reshape the world around it. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every coordinated movement became proof that freedom is not always seized in open rebellion. Sometimes it lives in the space between obedience and observation. Their actions left a mark invisible to the Baron and his sons but indelible in their own lives, a demonstration that power is never absolute, when intelligence, unity and courage exist beneath the surface. The twins transformed fear into strategy, oppression into understanding, and survival into a form of resistance that no chains, no commands and no authority could fully suppress. In the end, their story reminds us that true strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it moves unseen, shaping destiny quietly yet irreversible. The twins proved that even in a world designed to erase them, they could define their own existence, and in doing so change everything, not through violence, but through resilience, unity and the courage to act when the world least expects it. Their legacy is a testament to the power of subtle courage, the knowledge that even the smallest, most careful acts of agency can ripple outward, altering lives, systems and history itself. In their quiet rebellion they became more than slaves. They became the architects of their own freedom, the invisible force that shifted the course of everything around.